Hello and welcome to Banana Jam Games. As usual, I'm Ellis, and today we are going to continue talking about Strange Shoals. Now, with the pace that James has been working at, implementing new features on an almost daily basis, it's getting very difficult to keep track of exactly where things are, but we still believe that this is a chronological timeline of events and when features were implemented, with a brief explanation of any challenges we faced and ideas we had along the way. So, at the end of last week, pretty much everything was coming together. The core game loop was done, and you could catch fish, and that was basically it, which is really good considering it's a fishing game. We kind of needed that. So afterwards, it was a case of looking at all the other different features that we had intended to put into the game that would essentially be useful for just quality of life and also to make it an enjoyable multiplayer experience. So we started off by getting the UI elements put into the game. What this meant is that there was a menu and that you could essentially go back and look at the fish you've caught, so that it wasn't a kind of one and done with the fish, that they popped up on screen once and then you were done with them, you know? No further questions. James went for a really simple UI design, and given the pixel size of the screen or the window that we are using, this was kind of essential, and we couldn't really exactly have a beautiful graphic. But that also works out quite well because neither of us are fantastically trained artists, but one of us may be getting better as time goes on. Throughout the entire development of the fishing game, I have been doing fish and object art just continuously, and this will likely be the case going up to launch. We have promised to deliver over 100 objects, or spot on 100 objects and fish for release, and given how easy James has made it to implement new fish into the game, with a simple document dictating the rarity, the time it gives you to catch the fish, and also how many clicks it takes to catch the fish, it's essentially a case of dropping the assets straight in and updating the object sheet, which will pull all that information into the game. At the moment, we're at around 30 objects, which is not as far as we'd like to be, but chances are that going forward it's going to be a lot easier to implement and create art far quicker. But on top of this, we also decided that we were going to have some simple emojis for the multiplayer in the game. Now, we've already gone over the different services that we looked into using, and ultimately we found one that we believe is going to be suitable for launch, but depending on interest we might also still need to change that. In terms of how much interest Strange Shoals is getting, that will be something that we go over next week. So the interesting thing about the emojis is that obviously they are quite small on the screen, and they're always going to be. And actually, as it comes to filming this video, I believe that there may need to be some updates to the artwork that I've put forward for the emojis. At the moment there are about 15 different pieces of artwork to be used, well 15 or thereabout pieces of artwork to be used as emojis in the game, and as soon as I had created all of these, James started to implement a bar at the bottom of the UI, which you can easily scroll across to click and then use the emoji. Now obviously this only turns up in the multiplayer, as there's very little use for it in single player, and as such we also began to test the multiplayer this week. Now we tested it several times, just essentially to stress test the server and get a good understanding of what the game looks like in multiplayer. There were a couple of issues, but overall we were aware of them, and because we tested this early in advance of the game's launch, we have plenty of time to refine it and essentially polish it, soften some of the edges as it were. The main problem being that the game essentially was a bit janky, and every time the server needed to request an update to find out whether the other player had caught fish or sent an emoji, the game would almost freeze to an extent, and by the time it unfroze you only had maybe 1 second of viewing the emoji or the fish before it would technically time out and disappear. So obviously we knew this was something that we were going to fix for launch, and whilst we couldn't get too excited about the multiplayer because of these issues, we did also still think it was very cool that we'd managed to even get this far so early in development and so early as new game developers. And I'd love to take credit for it, but I'm gonna put it down to James. With regards to the pixel art, there's also been a lot of learning. Now I use a simple program called Pixel Art Studio free because, surprise surprise, it's free, but it's also shockingly actually A, quite easy to use, and B, quite in depth with the amount that you can do. Obviously you can pick the canvas size that you're going to use, you have a full RGB scale to take advantage of, and as previously mentioned for Fire Me I Insist, there's an animation tab that essentially allows you to make each frame and run it at whatever FPS you're going to use. So as untrained artists, it's probably the best tool for us in terms of ease of access and also simplicity. But it turns out there is still more you can do with it. So when it's come to shading on the different fishes, I've made full advantage of different layers, essentially using a layer to put a brighter color on the one end and then slowly reduce it to a darker color on the other end, and then also reducing the opacity so that that has a nice warming effect on the colours that are already there. This essentially adds just a little bit of lighting to the fish and makes them really look top-notch. Now, as with any project, the game design was not necessarily perfect by the time that we had started working on the game, and there were still a few things that we did decide whether or not we wanted to add. Now, the multiplayer aspect of the game is definitely a unique selling point, and whilst there are definitely other desktop fishing games out there, none of them, as far as we can tell, have multiplayer. And yes, you could potentially say that a lot of people wouldn't want a desktop game that has multiplayer, but we feel that it is actually a really interesting concept that would allow you to engage with your friends on a very minimal, passive level, even whilst you're working or doing other things and not necessarily chatting. But by all means, the sales of the game will dictate how true that is. But we still wanted to implement more. One of the key things that I know myself when it comes to games is that I thoroughly enjoy progression. If there's no progression in the game, it almost feels like there's not a huge reason for me to play. Now, I know there's plenty of gamers out there that don't necessarily care about that. They're just interested in the gameplay loop, maybe the aesthetic of the game, maybe even just the music, and they can play that game over and over again with no achievements, no stats. Achievements are something that we would like to implement in the game at a later date. However, we would really like to make a fully functioning, interesting game first, before trying to figure out the Steam API. And also on top of that, with the big challenge being multiplayer in this game, achievements is something we feel that we can push to the side until after launch. So we wanted something progression-wise. Now, if you played James's earlier game, Starship Sprout, you would know that there was a really cool shop function in the game that allowed you to upgrade your ship, sell certain plants and samples, and just generally chat with people. And this was a really cool function. However, James seemingly felt that it was a big frustration, and as such doesn't necessarily want to create a shop UI for our desktop fishing game, or would rather avoid it at the very least. And I can't necessarily disagree, as I've said previously, because of the other big tasks that we have with this game, avoiding things that are going to extend the development duration of the game and could overall put us in a development hell where this game ends up taking a year, causing it to get beaten out by other well-established desktop fishing games that also decide that now all of a sudden they want to do multiplayer. Keeping the shop out of the game for now, or indefinitely, is something I can't necessarily argue with. But I and many other gamers would still probably like some form of progression in the game. So after some heavy back and forth and a lot of debate, me and James finally settled that we were going to add a variety of backgrounds. Now, the initial background done by Miss Hammond was absolutely perfect. The colour scheme and the general design hits a very nice and, dare I say, cozy feeling that a lot of people want from their games, especially to sit in the desktop. But at the time of recording, with several backgrounds developed, what I'm starting to think is that I have not hit this cozy style. But given that we will have multiple different options for backgrounds, I don't necessarily know that that's an issue. We will go further into the backgrounds next week and the designs that I've done for them. But if you wanted to leave down in the comments perhaps whether or not you think all of the backgrounds should be cozy, or rather if we just have a variety of backgrounds, some cozy, some not, so that people can select the ones that, as they choose, that would be massively helpful. And you'd be helping us choose something about the game, which is like, you know, community input. It's really good. It'd be really nice, I could say. So quite simply, we have made it so that in the game, if you collect certain fish, which obviously may or may not have certain rarities and difficulties to catch, those specific fish, or a certain amount of those specific fish, will then unlock a certain background. And next week we'll go into some of the designs that have been mocked up for the different backgrounds in the game, and the different challenges or requirements, specific conditions that we've had to keep the same to not mess with the rest of the game. And that's pretty much everything we did for the week. Continuing with pixel art, testing the multiplayer, adding emojis, and furthering the core gameplay loop for users has been everything that we've focused on. But by the end of the week there was one last thing that we did manage to do, and this was getting everything ready and put up onto Steam. By me, I insist, was not necessarily rushed when it came to Steam, but arguably looking back, if we'd have got everything ready on Steam much earlier, then we probably could have done a bit more research, got to grips with the different functions of the Steamworks website, and just overall had a better understanding ready for launch, rather than running around last minute packing for a holiday that we have to go on, we've committed to, but somebody's left the armbands out. And also, when you get to the airport known as Steam, they will take 3 to 5 days to check your bags. So we decided we would get our Steam page up as soon as possible. A, to start building some interest, and B, to make sure that we could have as much ready for launch as possible. And that if we did want to include certain features like trading cards and achievements, and we had the time to implement them prior to launch, that we would still be able to research them and get to good grips with them. Although now that I think about it, we could have potentially like looked back at Fire Me Iron Cyst and looked at the achievements on there. But it doesn't matter. So if you wanted to take a look at Strange Shores on Steam, by all means, the link will be in the description. And if you wanted to wishlist it, it would be massively appreciated. We will go into more detail next week about how the game is performing on Steam so far and the current feelings at Banana Jam Games when it comes to Strange Shores release. We are hoping and have suspicion to believe that it will be a relatively well-performing game. So by all means, if you wanted to subscribe down below or join us in Discord to keep up to date with everything in the development and make sure that you are made aware of any changes, any news and any new features that we do implement, please join us there, as we could always seek your input. And also, we at Banana Jam Games would really like to build a community of supportive gamers and game developers if possible. So if you wanted to support us or feel like you are more invested and a part of the development of Strange Shores, then we would absolutely love to have you there. But without further ado, no, that's not the right one. But for now, no, that's not right either. But that would be all for this week. Thank you for watching. As always, I've been Ellis, and we'll see you next week.